6 months before the helicopters launched and the world watched American special forces drag the president of Venezuela out of his bunker, a secret meeting took place inside the White House that sealed the fate of a nation. It was July 2025. President Donald Trump sat with his most senior advisors to decide what to do about Nicolas Maduro. Inside the global economy breaks down the hidden forces shaping the world economy. The narrative you have been told is that this was a unified decision made by a government acting on high moral principles, that the United States government moved as one machine to remove a dictator for the sake of human rights and democracy. That is a lie. The truth is that there was a war inside the White House long before the war started in Caracas, and the decision to strike was not born out of strength or strategy. It was born out of frustration and a spectacular miscalculation of the economics of oil. On one side of the table sat the Secretary of State. He was a hawk, a man who had built his entire political career on the idea of aggressive American power. He viewed the existence of the Maduro regime as a personal affront to the Monroe Doctrine. He wanted Maduro gone. He wanted the military option on the table on day one. He argued that diplomacy with a socialist dictator was a sign of weakness that Beijing and Moscow would exploit. On the other side of the table was Donald Trump. And contrary to what his critics say in the media, Trump did not want a war. He did not want an invasion. He wanted a deal. Trump looked at the map of Venezuela, and he did not see a crusade for liberty. He saw a distressed asset. He saw a gas station that was under new management, and he wanted to change the management back to someone who would do business with him. His goal was straightforward and transactional. He wanted to negotiate a deal where Maduro stayed in power, but American oil companies got the keys to the kingdom. He wanted Chevron and Exxon and ConocoPhillips to replace the Chinese and the Russians in the Orinoco Belt. He believed he could bully Maduro into becoming an American client. He thought he could use the threat of force to force a signature on a contract. The Secretary of State pushed back hard. He argued that you cannot do business with Maduro. He urged the president to abandon the fantasy of diplomacy and authorize a decapitation strike. But in that July meeting, Trump refused. He rejected the war plan. He famously told his aides that he would handle the Venezuela file his way. He would use pressure. He would use leverage. He would use the art of the deal, not the art of war. So the strategy shifted to strangulation. Trump ordered a naval blockade. It was not called a blockade publicly because that is an act of war. It was called enhanced counter-narcotics operations. But the effect was the same. The U.S. Navy parked destroyers off the coast of Venezuela. They intercepted ships. They choked off the flow of goods. The goal was to squeeze the Venezuelan economy until the military generals turned on Maduro, or until Maduro himself came to the table begging for a lifeline. By late December, the pressure was immense. The economy of Venezuela, which was already shattered, was now suffocating. The U.S. delivered a final ultimatum through back channels. Step down. Leave the country with your family. Go to a villa in Spain or Dubai. We will unfreeze your assets. We will guarantee your safety. Just give us the country. Maduro rejected the offer outright. At this point, Trump was still reluctant to pull the trigger. He knew that invasions are messy. He knew that wars are expensive. He knew that occupying a Latin American country plays badly with the voters at home. But then something changed. It was not a strategic shift. It was not based on new intelligence about weapons or threats. It was a psychological shift. Advisors began showing Trump videos of Maduro. While the U.S. Navy was blockading his coast, Maduro was on television. He was dancing salsa with his wife. He was eating empanadas on live broadcasts while his people starved. He was laughing. He looked relaxed. He looked like a man who did not respect the threat. He looked like a man who thought the American president was bluffing. To the inner circle, this was framed as a personal insult to the president. They whispered in Trump's ear that Maduro was mocking him. They said that the blockade was failing because Maduro did not fear American power. They argued that deterrence had collapsed. They said that if you do not strike now, you look weak. And in the world of Donald Trump, looking weak is the cardinal sin. In the final days of December, the United States launched a warning shot, a direct missile strike on a key Venezuelan port. It was a massive escalation. It destroyed infrastructure. It was designed to shock the regime into submission. The White House waited for the panic. They waited for the surrender call. Instead, Maduro appeared on television again the next day. He was smiling. He was defiant. He gave a speech rallying his supporters against the imperialist aggression. He seemed unfazed. That was the turning point. That was the moment the deal died and the operation began. American officials concluded that Maduro was openly ridiculing Washington. The decision was made to move forward not just with regime change, but with a decapitation strike aimed at the man himself. The time for leverage was over. The time for kinetic action had arrived. On the morning of January 3rd, 2026, the operation was executed. You know the rest. The helicopters, the special forces, the capture. Maduro was flown to New York in handcuffs. From a tactical perspective, the mission was a flawless success. The target was neutralized without a massive ground invasion. The president of Venezuela was gone. But almost immediately, a much bigger and darker question emerged. A question that nobody in that July meeting had bothered to answer. What happens now? It is difficult to believe that a superpower would decapitate a foreign government simply out of personal frustration and a bruised ego, but the evidence suggests that is exactly what happened. In the hours following the capture, it became terrifyingly clear that the administration had no plan for the day after. They had removed the man, but they had not changed the reality. The Venezuelan state institutions remained intact. The bureaucracy was still there. The poverty was still there. The massive foreign debt was still there. The armed gangs were still there. The only difference was that the man at the top was gone, and the United States was now holding the bag. There is a famous rule in geopolitics often attributed to Colin Powell regarding the invasion of Iraq. You break it, you own it. By forcibly removing the head of state Washington had effectively taken ownership of a failed state of 30 million people. The United States was now the landlord of a collapsed building, and this brings us to the great economic lie of this entire operation: the oil. For months, Trump had sold this intervention to the American public and to himself as a business opportunity. He portrayed Venezuela as a prize. He talked about the oil reserves as if they were a vault of gold waiting to be opened. He convinced himself that once Maduro was gone, American energy companies would rush in and turn on the taps. He thought it would be a repeat of the early 20th century oil boom. But turning that ambition into reality proved to be a delusion. In truth, the operation has dragged the United States into a financial black hole. Here is the reality that the politicians ignored. American energy companies do not want Venezuela. Earlier in 2025, the Venezuelan opposition had been running around Washington, lobbying everyone who would listen. They promised that if the U.S. removed Maduro, they would open up every oil field and every gas reserve to American firms. They promised a privatization bonanza. They said the Chinese would be kicked out and the Americans would be invited in. But here is the irony. Maduro had made the exact same offer. Behind closed doors, Maduro had offered to kick out the Chinese and give the oil to the Americans if they just let him stay. Trump rejected Maduro's offer because he wanted the man gone. He accepted the opposition's offer because he thought it would be a gold rush. Then came the miscalculation. After the raid, the White House called the CEOs of the major American oil companies. They expected enthusiasm. They expected plans for massive investment. They expected announcements of new drilling projects. Instead, they got silence. Industry executives privately told the administration that they had zero interest in pouring billions of dollars into Venezuela. Why? Because the economics do not work. Venezuela's oil sector is a rust bucket. It has been neglected for 20 years. The pipelines are leaking. The refineries are broken. The export terminals are crumbling. The skilled engineers fled the country a decade ago. To get production back to where it was in the 1990s would require capital injections of hundreds of billions of dollars. And it is not just the infrastructure. It is the oil itself. This is the detail that the politicians miss. Venezuela does not have the light sweet crude that comes out of Texas or Saudi Arabia. It has extra heavy sour crude. It is like tar. It is thick and sludge-like. It is expensive to extract. It requires special upgraders to turn it into something that can be refined. Those upgraders are broken. They were built by American companies in the 90s and then nationalized and ruined by the socialist government. Fixing them takes years. At current oil prices, investing in Venezuela is financial suicide. Why would ExxonMobil spend $50 billion in a chaotic, unstable country to pump expensive sludge when they can drill in Guyana right next door or in the Permian Basin in Texas for a fraction of the cost and zero political risk? The risk outweighs the reward. The oil companies look at Venezuela and they see lawsuits, they see corruption, they see security threats, they see a labor force that has been decimated, they see a legal system that does not function. This reality created a panic inside the White House. The operation had been justified by the promise of economic plunder. But the companies that were supposed to do the plundering refused to show up. The looters looked at the prize and walked away. So now the administration is improvising. They are exploring ways to use taxpayer money to guarantee the investments of private oil companies. They are talking about using government funds to rebuild the infrastructure so that private companies can profit later. It is the worst of all worlds. The U.S. military took the risk. The U.S. taxpayer will pay the bill, and the oil is still in the ground. Publicly, Trump insists that the energy sector will be rebuilt quickly. He talks about months. Privately, analysts say it will take decades. The numbers simply do not add up. The geology is difficult, the politics are toxic, the economics are broken. What has become increasingly clear is that the administration never planned for the economic reality of the occupation. Before January 3rd, Venezuela was a nuisance. After January 3rd, it became a liability. No new political order has emerged. The opposition is fractured. The military is waiting to see who pays them. The economy is dead. And the United States is now the administrator of this chaos. We are responsible for feeding the population. We are responsible for keeping the lights on. We are responsible for the debt. We are responsible for the hospitals that have no medicine. We are responsible for the schools that have no books. If there is a famine in Venezuela now, it is an American famine. If there is a riot, it is an American riot. If the power grid fails, it is an American failure. History offers many warnings about interventions that begin with a bang and end with a whimper. We saw it in Iraq. We saw it in Libya. The assumption that the oil would pay for the occupation is the oldest lie in the book. It was false then, and it is false now. Washington has crossed a line that cannot be uncrossed. They decapitated a sovereign government. They proved they could do it. But in doing so, they trapped themselves. The question now is not whether the operation was a success. The capture was a success. The question is whether anyone involved truly understood what that success would cost. The United States went down to Venezuela looking for an asset. Instead, they acquired a massive distressed asset that nobody else wants to buy. The trap has snapped shut, and we are the ones inside it. Consider the geopolitical vacuum this creates. For years, China and Russia propped up Maduro. They loaned him money. They sold him weapons. But when the U.S. Navy showed up and the helicopters landed, Beijing and Moscow did nothing. They did not send a fleet. They did not start World War III. They simply stepped back. Why? Because they knew what the U.S. was getting into. They knew that Venezuela was a money pit. They were happy to let the Americans take over the burden of subsidizing a failed state. In a way, the raid was a gift to China. It removed a liability from their balance sheet and transferred it to the U.S. Treasury. Now China can sit back and criticize American imperialism while watching the U.S. struggle to rebuild a country that requires endless funding. They can watch the U.S. bog down in another nation building exercise in the Western Hemisphere while they focus on Asia. The irony is bitter. Trump wanted to beat China and Venezuela. Instead, he relieved them of a bad investment. We also have to look at the domestic impact in the U.S. The administration promised that this would lower gas prices. They promised a flood of cheap Venezuelan oil. But, as we have seen, that oil is not coming anytime soon. If anything, the chaos in Venezuela might disrupt the little production that was left, causing prices to spike. The American voter who supported the raid because they wanted cheaper gas is going to be disappointed. And disappointment turns to anger very quickly in politics. There is also the question of migration. For years, millions of Venezuelans have fled their country heading north to the U.S. border. The administration argued that removing Maduro would stop the flow. They said that once freedom was restored, the people would stay. But people do not flee because of ideology. They flee because of hunger. They flee because of violence. They flee because of a lack of opportunity. Removing Maduro does not fix the hunger or the violence overnight. In fact, the uncertainty of the post-raid chaos might accelerate the exodus. If the U.S. fails to stabilize the economy quickly, we could see a new wave of migration even larger than before. And this time, the migrants will be fleeing a country run by the United States. The political fallout of that would be catastrophic for the administration. So where does this leave us? We are 6 months post-raid. The euphoria of the capture has faded. The reality of the occupation has set in. The U.S. is currently paying the salaries of the Venezuelan civil service. We are paying the soldiers so they do not mutiny. We are paying for the food imports. We are burning billions of dollars a month to keep the country on life support. And there is no exit strategy. We cannot just leave. If we leave, the country collapses into civil war and the gangs take over. We have to stay. We have to rebuild. We have to govern. We have become the colonial power in the 21st century, not out of grand strategy, but out of a lack of foresight. We bought the country because we broke it. The story of the Venezuela raid will be studied for generations. Not as a triumph of military power, but as a case study in the failure of grand strategy. It is a lesson in what happens when you let ego drive policy. It is a lesson in what happens when you believe your own propaganda about easy wars and paying for them with oil. The oil was a mirage. The victory was a trap. As we look at the situation today, the U.S. flag is metaphorically flying over Caracas. But it is flying over a ruin. The challenge now is not fighting the enemy. The enemy is gone. The challenge is fighting the entropy, the decay, the rot. And that is a fight that cannot be won with special forces or drone strikes. It can only be won with money. Trillions of dollars. Money that the U.S. does not have to spare. So the next time a politician tells you that a foreign intervention will pay for itself, remember Venezuela. Remember the meeting in July 2025. Remember the promise of the oil. And look at the reality of the rust and the sludge. The dealmaker made the deal of a lifetime. He acquired a country, but he forgot to check the inspection report. And now the repair bill is coming due. The world is watching. Allies are watching to see if the U.S. has the stamina to rebuild. Enemies are watching to see if the U.S. bleeds out financially. And the Venezuelan people are watching, waiting to see if their new landlord is any better than the old one. The capture of Maduro was the end of one chapter and the beginning of a much harder one. The easy part is over. The hard part has just begun. This is the hidden cost of the new American assertiveness. It is easy to destroy, it is hard to build, and it is very expensive to own. The naval blockade worked, the pressure worked, the raid worked, but the strategy failed because the strategy assumed that the prize was valuable. It assumed that the oil was liquid gold. It assumed that the market would solve the political problem. All those assumptions were wrong, and now we are living with the consequences. We are living in a world where the U.S. is actively managing the domestic affairs of a South American nation. We are deciding who runs the central bank. We are deciding who runs the port authority. We are deep in the weeds of imperial management. This distracts from the bigger challenges. It distracts from the competition with China in technology. It distracts from the reindustrialization of America. It ties up resources and attention in a peripheral theater. It is the classic mistake of empires. Overextension, getting bogged down in places that do not matter strategically because of pride and short-term thinking. In the end, the Venezuela operation might be remembered as the moment the U.S. finally overplayed its hand in Latin America. The moment we proved we could take whatever we wanted, but lost the ability to do anything useful with it once we had it. The silence of the oil rigs in the Orinoco Belt is the loudest sound in the world right now. It is the sound of reality crashing into fantasy. And as the sun sets over the broken refineries of Venezuela, the American taxpayer should take a good hard look, because they just bought them. And there is no refund policy on revolutions. We will continue to track the money. We will continue to track the oil that isn't flowing. And we will continue to expose the gap between what is said in the press briefing room and what is happening on the ground. Because in the global economy, truth is the most valuable commodity of all. And right now in Venezuela, it is in very short supply. The raid was cinematic. The capture was dramatic. But economics is boring. Economics is slow, and economics always wins in the end. The ledger must balance. And right now, the Venezuela ledger is written in red ink as far as the eye can see. This is the true story of the Venezuela raid, not the story of the soldiers who kicked down the door, but the story of the accountants who looked at the books the next morning and realized that the victory was actually a bankruptcy. And that is a story that you will not hear on the evening news. But it is the story that will shape the next decade of American foreign policy. The ghost of the Venezuelan oil industry will haunt Washington for a long time to come. The decision made in that July meeting was the first domino. The blockade was the second. The raid was the third. But the chain reaction is still going. And we do not know where the last domino will fall. All we know is that it will be expensive. Stay tuned. The bill is in the mail.